August 20th, 1947. Courtroom 600, Nuremberg. 23 defendants face the tribunal. Among them, one stands alone. Herta Oberheuser, the only woman in the dock. She's a trained physician, 36 years old, educated at prestigious German universities. She completed her medical degree in 1936, earned her doctorate in 1937, took an oath to heal. Today, she'll receive a 20-year prison sentence for turning that oath into a license to mutilate. Not for combat, not for following battlefield orders, for medicine, for taking Polish women prisoners at Ravensbrück, breaking their legs with surgical instruments, deliberately infecting the wounds with gangrene, wood splinters, and ground glass, then watching them scream without offering morphine. Now, pay attention, because this is what changes everything. The judges don't sentence Oberheuser based on the scale of her crimes alone. They sentence her because her case proves something the tribunal needs the world to understand. A woman with a medical degree, trained to heal, can become just as monstrous as any camp executioner when professional ambition replaces human conscience. The experiments she conducted at Ravensbrück weren't accidents of war. They were calculated research projects designed to test how much damage a human body could endure. She documented outcomes, she photographed wounds, she kept clinical records while women begged for water and she gave them vinegar instead. This is the story of how a licensed doctor became a war criminal, how Ravensbrück, a camp built specifically to imprison women, became a laboratory where human beings were reduced to test subjects. How 74 Polish women, most of them young resistance fighters, were selected for experiments that would leave them permanently disabled or dead. And how 5 years later, the evidence Oberheuser herself created would seal her conviction in a courtroom that established the foundation for every medical ethics rule protecting you today. The question isn't whether she committed crimes. The evidence made that impossible to deny. The question is how a woman trained to save lives convinced herself that mutilating prisoners in the name of research was acceptable, how the camp's medical infrastructure enabled systematic torture under the guise of science, and why, despite overwhelming evidence, she would serve barely 5 years in prison before walking free and attempting to practice medicine again. Because this isn't just about one Nazi doctor. This is about the moment medical ethics became law. The Nuremberg Code, informed consent, patient rights, every protection separating legitimate medicine from experimentation, as torture exists because prosecutors opened files from Ravensbrück and forced the world to see what happens when doctors stop viewing patients as humans. By the end of this, you'll understand why Oberheuser's crimes, though smaller in scale than other Nazi atrocities, became central to establishing principles that govern medical research worldwide. Why her trial testimony, combined with survivor accounts, demolished every defense her attorneys attempted. And why her post-war freedom represents one of the most troubling failures of post-war justice. First, we need to go back to 1942, to a concentration camp 90 kilometers north of Berlin, nestled against a lake in what should have been peaceful German countryside. To Ravensbrück, where the SS built barracks specifically designed to contain women. Where Polish resistance fighters, Jehovah's Witnesses, political prisoners, and so-called asocials were worked, starved, and subjected to conditions that killed thousands. And where, in a camp hospital that should have provided care, doctors saw an opportunity. Before we continue, if you're interested in detailed historical analysis of WW war crimes, medical ethics violations, and the legal proceedings that shaped modern protections using primary trial documents and survivor testimony, subscribe to this channel. It supports the work and signals you want more content examining how atrocity becomes evidence and how courts draw lines that medicine must never cross. And as this story unfolds, drop a comment answering this. When a doctor prioritizes research over patient welfare, at what exact moment does medicine become torture? I read every response, and there's no simple answer. All right, let's continue. Ravensbrück opened in May 1939 as the Third Reich's largest concentration camp designed for women. Its location was strategic, far enough from Berlin to maintain operational secrecy, close enough to supply forced labor to German factories desperate for workers as men went to war. The camp followed standard SS design, wooden barracks surrounded by electrified wire and guard towers, administrative buildings, punishment cells, and crucially, a revere, the camp infirmary. That infirmary is where our story centers. Because in 1942, as the German military faced mounting casualties on the Eastern Front, senior Nazi medical officials identified a research opportunity. Wounded German soldiers were dying from infected battlefield injuries, particularly when sulfonamide drugs, early antibiotics, failed to control gangrene. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Heinrich Himmler's personal physician and a prominent orthopedic surgeon, proposed a solution. He would conduct experiments testing infection treatment protocols, not on volunteers, not on animals, on prisoners at Ravensbrück who had no ability to refuse. Gebhardt needed assistance. He recruited Dr. Fritz Fischer, an experienced surgeon. And he recruited Herta Oberheuser, who had joined the Nazi Party in 1937, the same year she earned her medical doctorate. Oberheuser became the camp's attending physician and Gebhardt's direct assistant in what would become known as the sulfonamide experiments. Here's how the experiments worked, and pay attention to the clinical precision because that precision becomes evidence that destroys every defense Oberheuser later attempts. The procedure began with selection. Camp administrators identified Polish women prisoners, most between ages 18 and 35, primarily political prisoners arrested for resistance activities. They were young, relatively healthy, despite camp conditions, exactly the profile Gebhardt wanted for controlled research. The women were told they were being transferred to lighter work assignments. Instead, they were brought to the Revier under guard. The first series of experiments started in July 1942. Oberheuser and Fischer worked together, though evidence presented at trial showed Oberheuser performed procedures independently on multiple occasions. The methodology was systematic. Subjects were anesthetized, though later experiments used insufficient anesthesia, or none at all, to observe pain responses. Surgical incisions were made in the leg, typically the lower leg or thigh. Then came the infection protocol. Oberheuser didn't simply observe naturally occurring infections. She created them. She introduced bacteria cultures directly into open wounds. She inserted wood shavings, ground glass fragments, metal splinters, materials designed to guarantee severe infection and maximum tissue damage. Some wounds were deliberately contaminated with gangrene cultures, ensuring necrosis would spread rapidly. The incisions were then sutured closed, trapping the infectious material inside. What happened next is where medical care should have begun. Instead, observation replaced treatment. Oberheuser monitored how infections progressed. She recorded fever patterns, tissue necrosis rates, the spread of gangrene through muscle and bone. Some subjects received sulfonamide drugs, the treatment being tested. Others received nothing, serving as control subjects to measure baseline death rates. The women weren't told what was happening to them. They woke from anesthesia with bandaged legs and escalating pain. Within days, fever spiked. Wounds became inflamed, swollen, discolored. The smell of rotting tissue filled the infirmary. Women screamed, they begged for water. Oberheuser gave them vinegar instead, a deliberate choice to increase suffering during observation periods. Let me give you specific examples, because the details matter when understanding how prosecution built its case. One group of women received incisions infected with gas gangrene, a particularly devastating bacterial infection that destroys muscle tissue rapidly. Without aggressive treatment, gas gangrene kills within days. Oberheuser knew this. She had the medical training to recognize symptoms. She watched women's legs swell to twice normal size as gas pockets formed under the skin. She documented the progression with photographs and written notes. She did not intervene until the experiment protocol dictated. Another group had their tibias, the large bone in the lower leg, deliberately broken, not fractured accidentally, surgically broken with instruments. Then the fracture sites were infected with bacteria and foreign matter. The purpose was testing whether infections in broken bones responded differently to sulfonamide treatment than soft tissue infections. The women endured both broken bones and spreading infection simultaneously. Many developed chronic osteomyelitis, bone infections that persisted for years after liberation. A third experimental series involved amputations. When infection spread beyond what sulfonamides could control, Oberheuser performed surgical amputations without adequate anesthesia. She removed legs, portions of legs, excised massive sections of infected tissue. Some women survived these procedures, many didn't. Those who did survive became permanently disabled, unable to walk without assistance. The death toll from these experiments is documented. At least 5 women died directly from infections introduced during Oberheuser's procedures. Many more suffered permanent disabilities. Several dozen endured chronic pain, mobility limitations, and psychological trauma that lasted their entire lives. Now here's what made this legally significant beyond the immediate brutality. Oberheuser kept records. She maintained patient files, though the term patient mocks what these women actually were. She photographed wounds at various infection stages. She corresponded with Gebhardt about experimental outcomes. She filed reports with SS Medical Administration. That documentation habit, that professional compulsion to record scientific observations, created the evidence that would convict her 5 years later. Because when Allied investigators liberated Ravensbrück in April 1945, they found filing cabinets filled with medical records describing experiments in clinical language, records that made denial impossible. But the experiments didn't happen in isolation. They required institutional support, resources, authorization. And that support structure left a paper trail showing exactly who knew, who approved, who enabled systematic torture disguised as research. Gebhardt reported directly to Heinrich Himmler, who approved the experiments explicitly. The SS provided prisoners, guards, medical supplies, and surgical equipment. Camp Commandant Fritz Suren authorized the use of camp facilities and ensured subjects couldn't escape or refuse participation. Senior Nazi medical officials reviewed preliminary findings and authorized continued experimentation despite mounting deaths. In May 1943, Gebhardt presented experimental results at a medical conference in Berlin, attended by nearly 100 German military physicians. He described the Ravensbrück experiments openly. He discussed methodology, infection rates, treatment outcomes. He showed data derived from deliberately mutilating prisoners. Several doctors in attendance asked technical questions about his protocols. No one objected to the use of non-consenting human subjects. This normalization within German military medicine becomes crucial for understanding the trial 5 years later, because prosecutors needed to prove these weren't isolated acts by rogue doctors. They were systematic crimes enabled by institutional frameworks that treated prisoners as expendable research material. Oberheuser's role expanded beyond surgical procedures. She became the camp physician responsible for examining all new arrivals, determining work assignments based on physical condition, and maintaining the facade of medical care while operating an experimental laboratory. This dual role, legitimate doctor and experimental researcher, illustrates how thoroughly medical ethics collapsed within the camp system. The survivors remember her differently than they remember Gebhardt or Fischer. Gebhardt visited occasionally, a senior surgeon overseeing research protocols. Fischer performed surgeries with clinical detachment, but Oberheuser was present daily. She walked through barracks. She conducted routine medical examinations. She saw the same women repeatedly, watching experimental subjects deteriorate week by week, and she never stopped. One survivor group became known as the Rabbits, a nickname the Polish women gave themselves because they were treated like laboratory animals. These women, approximately 74 total across all experimental series, formed bonds that sustained them through unimaginable suffering. They supported each other when infections raged. They shared what little food they received. And critically, they remembered details, names, dates, procedures, outcomes, details that would become testimony 5 years later. The experiments continued through 1943. By autumn, several patterns had emerged that would prove legally devastating for Oberheuser. First, the research produced no meaningful medical advances. Sulfonamide drugs either worked or didn't based on factors already understood from conventional medical research. Deliberately creating severe infections in healthy subjects added no useful knowledge. Second, mortality rates and permanent disability rates were predictable and preventable. Oberheuser had the training to recognize when infections became life-threatening. She had access to treatments that could have saved lives. She chose observation over intervention repeatedly. Third, and most damning, some experiments had no plausible justification whatsoever. In late 1943, Oberheuser participated in bone, muscle, and nerve transplant experiments that had nothing to do with battlefield medicine. These procedures involved removing healthy tissue from one prisoner and attempting to transplant it into another. The experiments failed universally. Recipients developed massive infections and rejection responses. Several died. The procedures served no military purpose, tested no treatment protocol, advanced no therapeutic goal. These transplant experiments reveal something prosecutors would emphasize at trial. Oberheuser wasn't a reluctant participant following orders. She was an active researcher pursuing her own experimental interests, using an unlimited supply of human subjects who couldn't refuse. Now watch what happens when the war ends. Because the evidence doesn't disappear, it multiplies. April 30th, 1945. Soviet forces liberate Ravensbrück. The SS attempted to evacuate the camp as Allied armies approached, forcing thousands of prisoners on death marches. Many died during evacuation, but Soviet troops arrived before the camp was emptied, finding approximately 500 survivors, many desperately ill. Among those survivors were dozens of the Rabbits, women with scarred legs, chronic infections, and vivid memories of who did what. They began talking immediately, describing experiments to Soviet medical personnel, identifying doctors by name, pointing out the buildings where procedures occurred. But Soviet liberation posed a problem for Western prosecutors. The Soviets controlled access to witnesses and evidence. Diplomatic tensions between Stalin's government and Western allies complicated investigation efforts. It would take months before Polish survivors could provide formal testimony to American and British war crimes investigators. Meanwhile, Oberheuser fled. As the Third Reich collapsed, she left Ravensbrück and attempted to disappear into the chaos of post-war Germany. She used her medical credentials to find work as a physician, treating patients in a rural practice, hoping anonymity would protect her. It didn't. By late 1945, Allied investigators had compiled lists of wanted Nazi medical personnel. Oberheuser's name appeared repeatedly in survivor testimony. Former prisoners identified her with remarkable consistency, describing her appearance, her voice, specific procedures she performed. In 1946, she was arrested by American occupation authorities and transferred to Nuremberg to face trial. The doctor's trial began December 9th, 1946, officially United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al. The proceeding charged 23 defendants with war crimes and crimes against humanity for conducting medical experiments without consent. Oberheuser was the only woman among them. Chief Prosecutor Brigadier General Telford Taylor faced a strategic challenge. How do you present evidence of systematic medical crimes to judges trained in traditional law, where doctors aren't typically defendants and healing professions aren't associated with murder? His solution was methodical documentation combined with survivor testimony that made abstraction impossible. The prosecution presented the Ravensbrück experiments in January 1947. They started with documents. Gebhardt's reports describing experimental protocols. Oberheuser's medical records noting procedures performed, infection rates, outcomes. Photographs showing wounds at various stages. SS administrative records authorizing prisoner transfers to experimental subjects. Then came testimony that transformed clinical records into human suffering. Polish survivors took the stand. Women with permanent disabilities. Women who walked with canes because their legs never healed properly. Women who still bore visible scars from incisions made 5 years earlier. One survivor, Władysława Karolewska, testified in detail about her experience. She described being selected in July 1942, told she was being transferred to different work. She described waking from anesthesia with her leg bandaged, pain intensifying over days. She described Oberheuser examining her repeatedly, recording observations, providing minimal pain relief despite visible suffering. She described watching other women's conditions deteriorate, seeing legs swell grotesquely, smelling gangrene spread through the infirmary. She described permanent disability that prevented her from walking normally ever again. Another survivor testified that Oberheuser injected women with substances causing severe pain and swelling, then refused requests for water while documenting their distress. The detail was specific, verifiable, and delivered with the credibility of someone describing lived trauma, not abstract historical events. The courtroom went silent during these testimonies. Defense attorneys, who had prepared arguments about wartime medical necessity, faced women whose bodies bore permanent evidence contradicting every justification they planned to offer. Oberheuser's defense team attempted several strategies. First, they argued she was following orders from superior officers, specifically Gebhardt, who designed the experimental protocols. This defense might have worked for lower-ranking personnel who assisted reluctantly. But prosecutors presented evidence showing Oberheuser volunteered for the position, joined the Nazi Party enthusiastically, and performed procedures independently without direct supervision. Second, defense attorneys claimed the experiments served legitimate military medical purposes, testing treatments that could save German soldiers' lives on the Eastern Front. This argument required demonstrating that the knowledge gained justified the methods used. Prosecutors demolished this claim by bringing in expert witnesses, Allied military physicians who testified that sulfonamide efficacy was already well established through conventional research. Deliberately infecting healthy subjects with gangrene added no useful medical knowledge. The experiments were torture dressed as science, producing unreliable data contaminated by variables Oberheuser never controlled. Third, the defense suggested Oberheuser's participation was limited, that she performed routine medical duties while others conducted experiments. Survivor testimony destroyed this claim completely. Multiple witnesses identified Oberheuser specifically as the doctor who performed their surgeries, who injected infectious materials, who monitored their deterioration while withholding adequate treatment. The medical records Oberheuser herself maintained confirmed her direct involvement in dozens of experimental procedures. The prosecution emphasized something that made Oberheuser's crimes particularly significant. She was a woman, a physician, someone society expected to embody nurturing and healing. Her presence at Ravensbrück wasn't incidental. She chose to work there. She chose to participate in experiments. She chose observation over treatment repeatedly when women under her care were dying from infections she deliberately created. Prosecutors argued this destroyed any defense based on following orders or military necessity. Oberheuser had agency. She had medical expertise sufficient to recognize what she was doing violated fundamental principles of medical ethics. She did it anyway, and her documentation proved she understood the consequences. By summer 1947, the tribunal had heard months of testimony. They reviewed thousands of pages of documents. They examined photographs showing wounds, scarring, permanent disabilities. They listened to survivors describe suffering in excruciating detail, and they faced a decision that would establish precedent for medical ethics law globally. The judges weren't just determining individual guilt, they were answering a fundamental question. What are the absolute boundaries of medical research? What can no military emergency, no national security interest, no potential scientific advancement ever justify? The evidence from Ravensbrück, specifically Oberheuser's meticulous medical records combined with survivor testimony, forced a clear answer. Human subjects must consent voluntarily. Prisoners cannot consent because they lack the freedom to refuse. Therefore, using prisoners for medical experiments is inherently criminal, regardless of potential benefits. This principle became the foundation of the Nuremberg Code, 10 points governing human subject research that prosecutors drafted specifically in response to evidence presented during the trial. Point 1 states unequivocally, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Not preferred, not ideal when circumstances allow. Essential, always, no exceptions. August 20th, 1947. The tribunal reconvenes for sentencing. The courtroom is packed with observers, journalists, survivors hoping for justice. Oberheuser stands as Judge Walter Beals reads the verdict. Guilty on counts of performing medical experiments without consent, causing death, torture, and permanent injury to concentration camp prisoners. The sentence, 20 years imprisonment. This was the harshest sentence given to any woman tried at Nuremberg. 7 male defendants received death sentences for comparable crimes. Oberheuser received prison time, a disparity that sparked immediate controversy. Some argued the judges showed leniency because she was a woman. Others suggested her crimes, while horrific, involved fewer victims than the mass medical experiments conducted by male defendants. The survivors who testified felt the sentence was inadequate. 20 years for deliberately infecting dozens of women, killing several, permanently disabling many others. But the tribunal's reasoning focused on establishing legal principles. Oberheuser's conviction sent a message. Female medical professionals are held to the same ethical and legal standards as male counterparts. Gender provides no exemption from war crimes prosecution. What happened next reveals the uncomfortable reality of post-war justice. Oberheuser served barely 5 years. In 1952, she was released early for good behavior. She returned to Germany and attempted to rebuild her medical career. She opened a family medical practice in Stocksee, a small town in Schleswig-Holstein. For 6 years, she treated patients. Mothers brought their children to her. People trusted her with their health. No one in Stocksee knew who she was or what she had done at Ravensbrück. Then, in 1958, a former Ravensbrück survivor recognized her. The survivor informed local authorities. Media coverage erupted. Public outrage forced action. The West German Medical Licensing Board finally revoked Oberheuser's license to practice medicine. She lived in obscurity until her death in 1978, never expressing public remorse, never acknowledging the full scope of her crimes. Her post-war freedom stands as one of the most troubling aspects of her case. A woman convicted of systematic medical torture served 5 years and then treated patients for 6 more before consequences caught up with her. This failure of justice highlights something prosecutors understood during the trial, but couldn't fully control afterward. Conviction establishes legal precedent. Punishment requires sustained political will. And in post-war Germany, priorities shifted rapidly from holding Nazis accountable to rebuilding society and countering Soviet influence. But the legal framework established by Oberheuser's conviction survived, even when enforcement failed. The Nuremberg Code, drafted specifically in response to evidence from cases like hers, became the foundation for every subsequent medical ethics standard worldwide. Let me show you exactly how this connects to your life today. How experiments conducted at Ravensbrück in 1942 shape every medical interaction you have 8 decades later. When you visit a doctor, you assume they will prioritize your well-being over research interests. That assumption isn't natural law, it's codified ethics born from Nuremberg. When you participate in a clinical trial, you sign consent forms explaining risks, benefits, and your right to withdraw at any time. Those forms exist because prosecutors laid Oberheuser's medical records on a table in 1947 and showed judges what medicine looks like when consent disappears. When universities establish institutional review boards that evaluate research proposals before experiments begin, that entire oversight system exists because the tribunal decided medical research needs external ethical review, independent of researchers' own judgment. When pharmaceutical companies must prove new drugs were tested ethically before seeking approval, those requirements trace directly back to principles established during the doctor's trial. The core principle is elegantly simple. Your body belongs to you. No doctor, regardless of credentials, regardless of research importance, regardless of potential lives saved, can use your body for experiments without your informed voluntary consent. That principle seems obvious now. In 1947, it wasn't codified in international law. It became law because Oberheuser's victims testified about what happens when that principle is abandoned. But here's the uncomfortable question this case forces us to confront. What does justice actually mean when dealing with systematic atrocity? Oberheuser received 20 years for deliberately infecting dozens of women, killing several, permanently disabling many others. She served 5 years and walked free. She lived another 26 years, never expressing genuine remorse, never fully acknowledging the suffering she caused. The survivors who testified against her lived with permanent disabilities, chronic pain, and psychological trauma for the rest of their lives. Is that justice? Or is it a legal proceeding that established important principles while failing the individual victims who suffered? There's no comfortable answer. The doctor's trial succeeded in creating the Nuremberg Code, revolutionizing medical ethics, and establishing that following orders doesn't excuse medical crimes. It failed to ensure proportionate punishment. It failed to prevent Oberheuser from practicing medicine again. It failed to extract meaningful accountability from someone who turned healing into torture. This tension between legal precedent and individual justice appears throughout post-war Nazi trials. Courts established principles that shaped international law for generations, but many perpetrators received light sentences, were released early, or escaped prosecution entirely. The gap between the significance of the legal framework established and the inadequacy of individual punishment remains one of the most troubling aspects of post-war justice. The survivors understood this better than anyone. The Polish women who testified at Nuremberg didn't do so expecting their suffering would be fully compensated or that Oberheuser would face punishment proportionate to her crimes. They testified to create a record, to ensure the world knew what happened, to establish that certain acts are absolutely forbidden, regardless of who orders them or what justifications are offered. And, in that objective, they succeeded completely. Every medical ethics code written since 1947 references Nuremberg. Every bioethics course taught at medical schools worldwide discusses the doctor's trial. Every researcher who conducts human subject studies must demonstrate their protocol complies with principles established specifically in response to evidence from Ravensbrück. Oberheuser's legacy is paradoxical. She's largely forgotten in popular memory, overshadowed by more notorious Nazi doctors like Joseph Mengele. She served minimal time for severe crimes. She lived freely for decades after release. Yet her case fundamentally changed how medicine operates globally. Consider what that means practically. When COVID-19 vaccines were developed in 2020-2021, the clinical trials that tested them followed protocols requiring informed consent, transparent risk disclosure, and the right to withdraw without penalty. Those requirements exist because prosecutors presented evidence from Ravensbrück showing what happens when research prioritizes data over human dignity. When gene therapy researchers propose experimental treatments for genetic diseases, institutional review boards evaluate whether the research design adequately protects subjects. That oversight exists because the doctor's trial established that medical researchers cannot be trusted to self-regulate when career advancement and scientific curiosity are at stake. When international human rights organizations monitor medical research in conflict zones, they reference standards established at Nuremberg. When medical licensing boards revoke credentials for ethical violations, they invoke principles first codified in response to cases like Oberheuser's. The survivors who testified in 1947 gave medicine a gift they never received themselves: protection. They endured experiments without consent so that legal frameworks could be established, ensuring no one else would have to. They carried permanent disabilities so that courts could draw a line medicine must never cross. That's the real legacy of this case. Not that justice was fully served, it wasn't, but that suffering was documented, transformed into evidence, and used to build protections that outlasted the perpetrators and survivors both. Now, let me ask you the questions this case forces into the open. Questions without easy answers. Questions that matter today just as much as they did in 1947. First, when does medical research cross the line into torture? Oberheuser maintained throughout her trial that she was conducting legitimate scientific inquiry, testing treatments that could save lives. The prosecution argued that methodology matters as much as intent, that deliberately creating suffering to observe outcomes is torture regardless of the stated research goal. So where exactly is that boundary? Is it consent? Is it proportionality between harm and benefit? Is it something more fundamental about human dignity that can't be reduced to procedural rules? Second, what does it mean when someone serves 5 years for systematic medical torture, walks free, and then treats patients for 6 more years before facing consequences? Does that represent a failure of the justice system? Or does it reveal something uncomfortable about how societies prioritize moving forward over holding individuals accountable? The survivors who testified against Oberheuser lived with permanent disabilities while she practiced family medicine in a quiet German town. Is there any sentence, any punishment, any form of accountability that could possibly balance that equation? Third, if the legal framework established at Nuremberg truly protects human subjects today, why do medical ethics violations still occur? Clinical trials in developing countries sometimes use different consent standards than trials in wealthy nations. Prisoners in some jurisdictions still participate in drug testing under conditions that raise serious questions about voluntary consent. Vulnerable populations, people with limited education, people desperate for medical care, sometimes agree to experimental treatments without fully understanding risks. The principles established in 1947 exist on paper, but do they protect everyone equally? Or do they primarily protect people with resources, education, and the ability to refuse? Fourth, consider Oberheuser's gender and how it shaped both her crimes and her prosecution. She was the only woman among 23 defendants at the doctor's trial. Some historians argue she received a lighter sentence than male defendants who committed comparable crimes, suggesting judges couldn't reconcile the image of a female doctor with the brutality of the evidence. Others argue her participation in experiments targeting women prisoners reveals something specific about how professional women in Nazi Germany navigated advancement opportunities within a deeply patriarchal system. Does gender matter when evaluating medical crimes? Should it? These questions don't have comfortable answers. They're designed to make you think, to challenge assumptions about medicine, justice, and accountability that we rarely examine closely. But here's what we know with certainty. Herta Oberheuser took an oath to heal and used it as permission to mutilate. She had training, resources, and institutional support that enabled systematic torture disguised as research. She documented her crimes with clinical precision, creating evidence that made conviction inevitable. She received a sentence that reflected the severity of her actions under law, but failed to deliver proportionate justice to her victims. And then she walked free, returned to medicine, and treated patients until a survivor recognized her enforced accountability the legal system had abandoned. That's the story. Not a simple narrative of evil punished, not a clean tale of justice served. A complicated, morally fraught account of how medical ethics became law, how legal precedent can succeed while individual justice fails, and how the gap between those two outcomes reveals uncomfortable truths about what societies prioritize when atrocity becomes history. The Nuremberg Code exists because prosecutors presented evidence from Ravensbrück. Your informed consent rights exist because survivors testified about what happened when consent disappeared. The protections you assume when you walk into a hospital exist because courts drew a line in 1947 and said medicine must never cross it again. But those protections required suffering to create. Women with permanent disabilities, women who endured infections deliberately introduced by a doctor who watched them deteriorate, women who carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. They paid the cost for principles that protect you today. And the woman who inflicted that suffering? She lived to 72, never expressing genuine remorse, never fully acknowledging what she did. That's not the ending we want. But it's the ending that happened. In confronting that reality, sitting with that discomfort, understanding that legal frameworks can succeed while moral justice fails, that's necessary if we're serious about ensuring the principles established at Nuremberg mean something beyond historical commemoration. So, tell me in the comments, do you think Oberheuser's 20-year sentence was appropriate? Or should she have received death like several male defendants who committed comparable crimes? Do you think early release after 5 years represented rehabilitation or failure of justice? And most importantly, do you believe the medical ethics protections established at Nuremberg adequately prevent similar abuses today? Or are there gaps we're not addressing? I read every comment. These questions don't have simple answers, and I'm genuinely interested in what you think. If this kind of detailed historical analysis using primary trial sources and survivor testimony is valuable to you, subscribe to the channel. It helps tremendously and signals you want more content examining how atrocity becomes evidence and how legal precedent emerges from moral reckonings. Hit the like button if you made it this far. It supports the work. I'll see you in the next one.